What would you do if the person you die for was the one who betrayed you? Alvin gave up everything, his freedom, his future, to save his brother. But behind bars, he learned the unthinkable. His wife, his blood, had twisted his sacrifice into something unforgivable. You're watching Vic's Crime Stories, where the darkest betrayals, the most shocking crimes, and the lines between justice and revenge are never what they seem. Subscribe now and decide for yourself who was right, who was wrong, and would you have done the same? There was a time when the world was softer for Alvin and Todd, a time when the sun seemed to linger just for them, casting golden light over their laughter as they played in the yard of their childhood home. Back then, the weight of the future was nothing but a distant thought, a shadow too faint to notice. Alvin, even as a boy, carried himself with a quiet strength, always one step ahead, always watching over Todd, his little brother, his responsibility. Their parents would smile from the porch, believing, hoping, that this bond would never break. But fate has a way of testing promises. The day their parents died was the day Alvin became more than a brother. He was barely 20, shoulders still learning how to carry grief, when he stood at that graveside, his hand gripping Todd's, trembling one. The wind howled through the cemetery, but Alvin didn't cry. He couldn't. Not when Todd's tears were falling fast enough for both of them. "I promised them I'd protect you," he whispered, voice rough with the weight of a vow too heavy for a young man to bear. No matter what. And so, Alvin did what he had to. He worked. Not one job, not two, but whatever it took to keep food on the table and a roof over Todd's head. Construction by day, loading docks by night, his hands calloused, his body aching, but never complaining. Todd was different. The more Alvin gave, the more Todd took, slipping further into trouble like a man diving into deep water without learning how to swim. Skipping school, running with the wrong crowd, coming home with split lips and hollow excuses. Every time, Alvin cleaned him up, paid off debts, smoothed things over, because that's what brothers do. Then came Janice. She was warmth in the middle of Alvin's storm. A woman who looked at him like he was something precious, not just a man worn down by the world. When they married, Alvin dared to believe in a fresh start. A small house, a steady job, maybe even peace. But Todd was still there, lurking in the background like a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. Older now, but no wiser. Still reckless. Still costing Alvin more than money could repay. "He's my brother," Alvin would tell Janice whenever she pressed him about Todd's latest mess. "I can't give up on him." And Janice, because she loved him, would nod and let it go. But love has limits, so do promises. Alvin just didn't know it yet, because the storm was coming. And when it hit, it wouldn't just break him, it would bury him. But that comes later. The night it all went wrong started like so many of Todd's bad decisions, in a dimly lit bar where the air smelled of stale beer and broken promises. The kind of place where men went to forget their troubles, only to find new ones waiting at the bottom of a glass. Todd sat hunched over the counter, his fingers tapping nervously against the chipped wood, his reflection warped in the dirty mirror behind the bottles of cheap liquor. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not after all the times Alvin had bailed him out. Not after all the second chances. But desperate men make desperate choices. The voices around him grew louder, more insistent. "Easy money," they whispered. "One quick job." The kind of words that slithered into a young man's ears when rent was due and debts were piling up. Todd's hands shook as he lifted the glass to his lips, the whiskey burning his throat but doing nothing to steady his nerves. He should have walked away. Should have called Alvin like he always did. But pride is a terrible thing. It stops a man from asking for help until it's too late. The gun felt heavy in his pocket as he stepped into the cold night air. Too heavy, like it was already dragging him down to someplace dark and final. The plan was simple, they said. In and out. No one gets hurt. But plans have a way of unraveling when fear enters the equation. When the alarm blared and the shouts erupted, Todd's world narrowed to the pounding of his own heart. Too fast, too loud. The gun went off before he even realized his finger had tightened on the trigger. The sound echoed like thunder in the small space, and suddenly everything was moving too slowly. The way the clerk stumbled back, the way the blood spread across his white shirt like some terrible crimson flower blooming in fast motion. In that moment, Todd knew two things with absolute certainty. His life as he knew it was over, and there was only one person who could save him. The phone trembled in his hand as he dialed, each ring stretching into eternity. When Alvin answered, Todd's voice broke like a child's. "Alvin, I messed up. I need help." And Alvin came. Of course he came. He always came. The police lights painted the street in swirling flashes of red and blue, turning the night into some grotesque carnival. Todd stood there, tears cutting through the dirt on his face, watching as Alvin did what he'd done 100 times before, stepped between Todd and the consequences of his actions. But this time was different. This time the price was too high. "I did it," Alvin said, his voice steady even as his hands were cuffed behind his back. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with finality. Todd wanted to scream the truth, to tear the confession from his brother's mouth, but fear kept him silent. The police led Alvin away, and Todd could only watch, helpless, as the taillights disappeared into the night. Alvin sat in the back of that squad car, believing he'd done the right thing, believing prison would be the worst of it, that his sacrifice would finally make Todd straighten up, grow up. He was wrong, so terribly wrong, because while steel bars could keep a man locked away, they couldn't protect him from what was coming. The real punishment wasn't the loss of freedom. It wasn't the cold cell or the endless days. It was what happened outside those walls. What happened to his life, his home, his wife. The first few months inside weren't so bad. Alvin could handle the concrete walls, the stale air that never quite circulated, the way time stretched and yawned like some lazy beast indifferent to human suffering. What kept him going were the letters. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, Janice's neat handwriting would appear, bringing him news of the outside world. She'd tell him about the weather, about the neighbors, about how she'd planted flowers by the porch because she wanted the house to look nice for when he came home. He'd trace his fingers over the ink, imagining her sitting at their kitchen table, the morning light catching her hair just so as she wrote to him. But then the letters started coming less often. The handwriting grew rushed, the pages shorter. Where she used to fill both sides with looping script, now she barely managed a few paragraphs. Alvin told himself she was busy. That life outside was hard too, that she was doing her best. He held on to that belief even when weeks passed without word, even when the other inmates started giving him those looks, the kind that said they knew something he didn't. John, the old-timer in the cell next to his, took pity on him one day. "Your wife stopped visiting?" he asked, lighting a cigarette with hands that had seen too many years behind bars. "Yeah, that's never good." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alvin wanted to argue, to defend Janice, but the doubt had already taken root, a weed growing in the cracks of his certainty. Outside those prison walls, life went on without him. Janice still woke up in their bed, still made coffee in their kitchen, still walked past all the little reminders of Alvin every single day. But now there was Todd. Always Todd. At first, it was innocent enough, him coming by to fix things around the house, to check in on her. Then it was dinners. Then it was late nights talking on the porch, the way people do when they're trying to convince themselves they're not doing anything wrong. Alvin had no way of knowing. Not then. Not as he lay on his thin prison cot, staring at the ceiling, wondering why Janice's last letter had been so short, why she'd stopped mentioning Todd altogether. The mind is a cruel thing when left alone too long. It starts filling in blanks with worst-case scenarios, painting pictures no one wants to see. The truth came on a Tuesday, just like those early letters used to. John slipped him a note during lunch, his eyes full of something between pity and warning. Alvin unfolded the crumpled paper with hands that didn't feel like his own. Just 5 words, but they hit like a sledgehammer. "Your wife and brother. They're more than family now." The mess hall, noise faded to a dull roar. Alvin read the words again, and again, as if maybe the third time they'd rearranged themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. They couldn't, because suddenly every unanswered letter, every missed visit, every vague reply made perfect, horrible sense. All those years protecting Todd, all those sacrifices, and this was his reward, his wife and his brother, the two people he'd trusted most in this world. While he rotted in here for a crime he didn't even commit, they'd been playing house, pretending he never existed. The letter fell from his fingers, floating down to land in a puddle of spilled coffee. Funny how the mind works in moments like these. Alvin found himself staring at that stain, watching the brown liquid slowly seep into the paper, blurring the words until they disappeared completely. A small, detached part of him thought that's what his life had become. Once clear and certain, now just a muddy mess of betrayal and regret. He didn't cry, didn't yell, just sat there, perfectly still, as something inside him shifted irrevocably. The Alvin who believed in loyalty, in family, in love, that man died in that moment. What remained was something else entirely. Something that would have scared the old Alvin. Something that should have scared Todd and Janice. Because prison bars can't hold a man's rage forever. And Alvin was counting down the days until he could look them both in the eye and ask why. The day Alvin walked out of prison, the sun felt too bright, the air too clean. It should have been a moment of triumph. A free man returning to reclaim his life. But freedom means nothing when everything you loved has been stolen from you. The bus ride home took hours, each mile stretching longer than the last, each passing minute feeding the quiet storm building inside him. He'd played this moment over in his mind 1,000 times. What he'd say, how he'd say it. But now that it was here, all he felt was cold. A deep, bone-chilling cold that no amount of sunlight could touch. When the familiar streets came into view, something in Alvin's chest tightened. There was the old grocery store where he used to buy Janice flowers. The park where they'd walked hand in hand on summer evenings. The street lights that had witnessed so many ordinary moments that now felt precious in memory. And then there it was. His house. The one he'd worked double shifts to buy. The one he'd imagined filling with children's laughter. The one that was supposed to be his sanctuary. Except Todd's car was parked in the driveway. Stephanie, Janice's sister, sat on the porch steps watching the kids play in the yard. She looked up as Alvin approached, her face draining of color. There was fear in her eyes. Good. She should be afraid. The children barely glanced his way. They were too young to understand the gravity of this moment, too innocent to recognize the walking storm that had just arrived at their doorstep. Alvin's fingers brushed against the cold metal in his pocket as he stepped past them. "This was my house," he murmured, barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. "My life." The words tasted bitter like ashes in his mouth. The screen door creaked open, that same familiar sound he'd been meaning to fix before everything went wrong. The smell of dinner cooking hit him first, something with garlic, Janice's specialty. Then the voices. Todd's laugh, loud and easy. Janice's softer response. The domestic symphony of cutlery against plates. They were sitting at his table, eating his food, living his life. When Alvin stepped into the doorway, time seemed to fracture. Janice's fork froze midway to her mouth. Todd's smile died on his lips. The silence that followed was so complete Alvin could hear the clock ticking in the next room, each second marking the end of something. "Alvin!" Janice's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale with shock. "We didn't think you'd come back this soon." The words hung in the air between them, absurd in their understatement. Alvin felt his mouth twist into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yeah," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Bad luck for you." Todd stood so fast his chair clattered to the floor. "Brother, listen, Dash," he began, hands raised in that familiar, pleading gesture Alvin had seen 100 times before. But this wasn't some bar fight or petty theft. This was the ultimate betrayal, and there would be no talking his way out of it. The gun felt heavy in Alvin's hand as he pulled it from his pocket. He'd imagined this moment so many times in his cell, but reality was different. Sharper, more vivid. Janice's scream cut through the air like glass shattering. Todd started begging, his words tumbling over each other. Apologies, excuses, desperate pleas. But the time for words had passed. When the first shot rang out, it was louder than Alvin expected. Janice's body jerked backward, her eyes wide with shock. Todd shouted something. Alvin didn't hear what, before the second shot silenced him forever. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the kitchen, mixing with the scent of their abandoned meal. 2 more shots followed, not because they were necessary, but because Alvin needed to be sure, needed to see it through to the absolute end. In a terrible quiet that followed, the only sound was Alvin's ragged breathing and the distant cries of children outside. He looked down at what he'd done, at the blood spreading across his kitchen floor, and felt nothing. No relief, no regret, just a vast, yawning emptiness where his heart used to be. The gun slipped from his fingers, landing with a dull thud beside Todd's outstretched hand. The same hand Alvin had held when they were children, when he'd promised to always protect his little brother. Some promises, it seemed, were meant to be broken. The police station lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, as Alvin sat at the scarred wooden table. His hands, still streaked with drying blood, rested palms down on the cold metal surface. The crimson patterns looked almost artistic in their way, the last fingerprints of a life he could never reclaim. Around him, officers moved in hushed tones, casting sideways glances at the man who had walked in of his own accord, who had sat down without being asked, who now waited with the patience of someone who had nothing left to lose. When the detective finally entered, his weary eyes took in the scene. The blood-stained clothes, the empty expression, the terrible calm that clung to Alvin like a second skin. No need for questions. The truth was written in every fleck of red, in every hollow line of Alvin's face. Yet the detective asked anyway, because procedure demanded it, because someone had to speak the words aloud to make them real. Alvin didn't wait for the question to be finished. His voice, when it came, was steady as stone, quiet as a grave. I killed them. A pause, just long enough for the weight of those 3 words to settle in the air. And I'd do it again. No remorse, no justification, just simple, brutal truth. The detective's pen hovered over the paper, as if uncertain whether to record something so final, so damning. Outside, the world continued unaware. Cars passed by on the wet streets, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Somewhere, children laughed. Somewhere, a couple argued over dinner. Life went on, just not for Alvin. Not anymore. The chair creaked as he leaned back, his mind drifting back through the years, back to where it all began. A memory surfaced, bright and painful. Young Alvin, barely 12 years old, standing by his parents' bedside. His mother's frail hand clutching his, her voice thin with illness, but fierce with maternal love. "Look after your brother," she'd whispered, her eyes boring into his with desperate intensity. "No matter what happens, you protect him. Promise me." And he had. Oh, how he had promised. Sealed it with tears and kisses and all the solemnity a child could muster. That promise had become his compass, his burden, his undoing. Now, sitting in this cold interrogation room with the smell of gunpowder still clinging to his clothes, Alvin understood what his mother never could. Some promises are chains that drag you down into darkness. Some loves are poison dressed as salvation. The boy who made that vow had died tonight along with everything else. The detective cleared his throat, pulling Alvin back to the present. There were forms to sign, procedures to follow, the mechanical dance of justice to perform. Alvin complied without resistance, his movements methodical, his mind strangely quiet. The storm had passed. All that remained was the wreckage. As they led him away, Alvin caught his reflection in the one-way glass. A stranger with dead eyes and blood on his shirt. Somewhere beyond those walls, 2 bodies were being zipped into bags. Evidence was being cataloged, and Stephanie was probably calling relatives with the terrible news. The cycle was complete. A brother's love had destroyed them all. The cell door clanged shut with finality. Alvin sat on the narrow bunk, staring at his hands. The hands that had worked so hard, loved so fiercely, and ultimately killed without hesitation. In the silence, his mother's voice echoed from long ago. "Protect him." He let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, wasn't quite a sob. Some promises destroy you, and some destructions are promises kept. And so, Alvin's story ends where it began, with a promise. A promise that twisted into something he never imagined. But what do you think? Was his revenge justice, or just another tragedy in a life already filled with too many? Could you have walked away? Or would you have pulled the trigger too? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. If the story left you with that heavy, unsettled feeling, then you need to watch The Brother Who Stole Everything next. Another tale of family, betrayal, and the lines love forces us to cross. The link is right on your screen. And if you're not already part of the VIX Crime Stories family, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because every week, I bring you another story that will make you question how far loyalty should go before it becomes a noose around your neck.